Yes. Hello, everybody. Jill Nagy-Reynolds from the SBA Columbus District Office. This webinar training today is in partnership with the SBA, the Ohio Department of Development, which includes the Small Business Development Center, the PTAC, the Ohio PTAC, which is the Procurement Technical Assistance Center, as well as the Minority Business Assistance Center. And this is a series of webinar trainings leading up to the Ohio Business Matchmaker, which will be at the Nutter Center in Dayton in a month. So hopefully those of you that are able to join us will do so. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce our presenter for today. It's Nicole Potroff. She is with Co-Prince McCall and Potroff LLC. She will be teaching us about federal teaming arrangements from a legal perspective, which is very, very important. We're very thankful to have her be able to participate today. So Nicole, if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself, I'm going to have you introduce yourself and get us started. One thing, as you have questions, everyone, if you can just put them in the chat, and I will do my best to answer them as she is presenting, but then we will have time for questions at the end of the presentation as well. All right, Nicole.
Yes, thank you so much, Jill. Thank you all for having me. I'm excited to be here. Teaming arrangements of all types are some of my favorite things to do with clients. They're wonderful ways to seek opportunities that small businesses may not otherwise be able to perform or compete for on their own. And it's a wonderful, wonderful way for companies to network and work together to achieve goals, and really makes agencies very happy as well. A lot of times to get the double resources, the joint resources and experience and personnel. And it's a fantastic way to grow your business as well. So we're going to dive right in. I have a lot of slides today. I had a hard time cutting any out because there's so many important parts of this. So I will go through them fairly quick. But as Jill said, let us know if you have questions and we're happy to elaborate on things. All right, this is me. I am Nicole Potroff. I'm an equity partner at Co-Prince McCall Potroff. We're a small boutique law firm. We only do federal government contracting. That's such a fantastic small niche area of law where we're really able to dive in deep. And we've got our blog, our Small GovCon blog. The link is in the corner down there. But between the blog and the very niche legal work that we do, we're really able to make ourselves experts on this subject matter. We're able to really tackle updates as they come out, new regulations, new cases that have big impact on the industry. It's a really fantastic small area of practice that we can just excel in because we're not worried about all the other things. We constantly tell our clients we can advise them on state law, other types of law, strictly federal government contracting, but there's a whole lot there. All right, here's a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to start with a little bit of a comparison, contrast type of thing of the joint ventures versus prime sub teams. I think this is huge to this day. I still have actually even sometimes agency officials kind of confuse the two types of teams. We have plenty of customers, clients that come to us with confusion on the two types of teams. And it can actually lead to a lot of problems because there's different requirements for both. So we'll talk about that. And then I'll give you kind of some pro tips for both types of teams. Then we'll go a little deeper into joint ventures. We'll talk about some of the specific requirements, what the agreements themselves should look like, and some of the other legal matters, performance of work, things like that. And then we'll dive into the prime sub team just the same way. We're going to talk about some big picture principles. I won't spend too long on limitations on subcontracting and ostensible subcontractor affiliation. I can and have done entire 2-hour presentations on each of those individually. So I'm going to work hard not to get too caught up on those. But they're also so important to keep in mind if you're considering a prime sub team. A lot of people don't even know about the latter one, the ostensible subcontractor. So I at least want to brief you on those. And then finally, we'll dive into the agreements themselves. And that's both teaming agreements and subcontract agreements. We are a TA law firm for sure. I know some law firms wouldn't necessarily tell you that they absolutely require you to have a TA or think you need a TA. We are one that thinks you do. I will go into all of those reasons why, and we can dive deeper into those as we go. Before we get started, just a legal disclaimer here. This is strictly for educational purposes. It's not individualized legal advice. And I'm sure you're well aware, a lot of times these type of arrangements can get very tricky. If you do have a longer question, a more individualized question, if it's one I can answer without legal advice, go ahead and send me an email and I'm happy to point you to the right regulations, send you a blog, whatever it may be. My email is down on that right-hand side of the screen. However, if it's something that I would need to give advice for, I would have to engage you as a client. But this is just a heads up that this does not do any create any sort of legal relationship or really consider the facts of your case. So further, it only covers the rules in effect when the presentation is given. So today, check for updates in the future. We're not seeing new rules daily or anything. SBA's rules tend to roll out a bit slower, but it's still important to keep that in mind. For example, limitation on subcontracting. It's only been recently that the FAR rule changed to match the other rules. And so that's one you want to make sure you know what rule is in effect when you are seeking this guidance, not necessarily just what is in effect at the time of the presentation. So if you're looking at this a few years later, look at the recording, you want to go make sure all the rules I'm giving you are still the rules I'm giving you. All right, we'll dive right into the compare and contrast of joint ventures versus teams. So both of these structures originate in FAR 9.601. It's actually funny. You'll see some solicitations will say things like whether the offer is a FAR 9.6011 or a FAR 9.6012 team. And I've had lots of clients reach out and say, I don't understand what this means. It's simply referring to the two types of teams. They just complicate it a bit sometimes by putting the entire citation in there versus saying that one is a joint venture, also technically a partnership under the federal law, and a prime sub team would be the second type. And there's not a lot of details in that regulation. You can go look at it. It simply says this, the first one is a joint venture structure, and the second one is one where the prime has the contract with the government, and then the prime also has a subcontractor. So we will compare and contrast these on our own. The regulation doesn't do much for information, but that's where it is if you want to see it. All right, so SBA's regulations for small businesses and their teammates, many teaming rules are going to be part of the SBA regulations and not the FAR. So the FAR is found at 48 CFR. If you're not aware, that's just the section of the Code of Federal Regulations that makes up the FAR. SBA's rules are found in section 13 CFR. So these are still valid and enforceable. And SBA's rules, like I just mentioned, consider a partnership to be a type of joint venture. So that is actually where that comparison comes to, that a partnership and joint venture are the same type of structure. So this is important to keep in mind, although it's probably common sense to most of you. We actually have had, in fact, an agency official yet again tell one of our clients that because something wasn't in the FAR, it didn't apply to what they were doing, the type of teaming they were doing, and they were absolutely incorrect. So both the FAR and the SBA's regulations will govern. In fact, most of the rules we're going to talk about today are the SBA's. All right. I love this little comparison here. I think it's a fantastic way to look at the two structures and really get a grasp on what the differences and similarities are. I'm going to bounce back and forth. I think that's the best way to compare them. So joint ventures. For joint ventures, both parties are what you call in privity of contract with the government. So that's just a fancy way of saying both parties are at the prime level. They both are responsible individually and jointly for the contract. If one of them can't perform, the other one has to. That's one of the structured regulations that actually has to go into the joint venture agreement. And both of them are entitled to the rights and remedies under that contract. So if the government were to, cause a delay or a problem that caused extra costs, and there needs to be some kind of remedy for that, both parties are able to work with the government, one-on-one to get that figured out and really have the rights and all the obligations as if they were each the prime on their own, even though it is a joint venture. So this is different from the prime sub team, where only one party, which is the prime, is going to perform at the prime contract level. That's the only one in privity of contract with the government. And so only the prime is responsible to the government. And as I mentioned, and I'm sure you can guess, only the prime has the rights and remedies under the contract as well. So if a subcontractor is working on a site and let's say there's government personnel interference, some kind of issue, and the subcontractor actually incurs some kind of injury or extra cost or something like that, you need to make sure when you are working with a prime that you have a pass-through clause, because the subcontractor actually has no rights to come to the government and say, look, you messed this up and we need some remedies here. So that's one important thing to keep in mind when you're deciding. In fact, probably the most important thing to keep in mind when you're deciding between these two types of teams. And the other big thing there is just the relationship. I have a lot of clients come to me and say, we're brand new. We found another company to work with that does a ton of this. Should we joint venture or should we prime sub team? And there's a lot of great reasons to do both, but one of the important things to consider is you're not really building that one-on-one relationship as a subcontractor. You can get the experience. There's ways you can get subcontractor past performance and things like that, but you're not building that one-on-one relationship with the government. And so it is sometimes preferred, if you can get a joint venture in, to do that route. Now, other reasons to do sub, and we'll talk about those later, but the joint venture does give you that one-on-one privity of contract with the government to start at a prime level. And sometimes that can be helpful if you're trying to really get your feet wet and in the industry. So for joint ventures, parties typically split profits and losses. So the rules do say you must split profits commensurate with the work performed. We, just being a fair, law firm, typically say in our agreements that parties should split losses equally with profits. Of course, that one is not dictated by the reg, but that seems to be the fairest way to do it. And then for a prime sub team, you would actually be in trouble if you had a profit splitting agreement, because that could be indicative of a sensible subcontractor affiliation. We'll talk about that later. But generally oh, go ahead.
Can I ask you a question about job costs? So like in joint venture agreements, some of the things that I'm seeing between firms that I work with is in an unpopulated joint venture, and you might talk about this, and this might be too technical, like the job cost seems to be an area of contention between them if it's not written into the joint venture agreement. So is that something that you have them build in?
By job cost, are you talking kind of like performance of work division?
Well, say it's an unpopular, well, and I don't want to get us off too far. So if it's an unpopulated joint venture and say like one party to the JV has an employee that costs 120,000 and the other party to the JV has an employee that costs 30,000 a year. Would that employee from the $120,000 employee, would that be a job cost associated with the contract that they're performing? I keep seeing that over and over again where they're arguing between that.
Sure. So I can tell you how it plays into the division of labor. So essentially, yes, every joint venture should lay out the division of labor very clearly. And one thing that we will do, you want to get as specific as you can. Sometimes joint ventures are a bit more general, especially when they're not ones that need to be approved. And they will say things like the parties will work out, who's going to perform what work at what cost later on. But because of those, the 40%, and we'll get into all this, but the 40% performance of work requirement for the small business or the socioeconomic lead venturer, agencies want to see, if they're going to look at the joint venture, they want to see to make sure that 40% of the costs they're paying are going to that small business or, WSB 8A, whatever. So if it's possible at the time of structuring the agreement to say the small business lead venture is going to provide the project manager who's going to be paid this much, and then the other venture is going to provide a, let's say finance manager, it's going to be paid this much. It's great to do that early on. The more you can work out early on, the less problems later. I don't know if that really answers the question as if the joint venture is really getting upset as to one employee costing far more than the other. That's more of a kind of private dispute type of thing. The only thing the federal rules really care about is if that is going to be the division of the labor, that when all is said and done, let's say it's services and it's all labor, there's no materials or anything, when all is said and done, that 40% of the, of the money is going to that small business or 8A or whatever.
No, I appreciate that. These are like minute details that aren't covered in SBA regulations or
Yes,
the FAR, which is why we try and have firms, if they can, seek legal counsel for these, because
absolutely.
having that laid out ahead of time will keep disputes from happening later. So I appreciate
Right.
it. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And something it doesn't say in the rules, but we have found in looking at the case law is that SBA's OHA will actually look to the limitation on subcontracting type calculations when it comes to calculating things like what the cost of materials were, what the work cost, what the personnel costs. So if you're ever, it's kind of strange, I realize, but if you're ever kind of wondering how to calculate those things for a joint venture, actually going over to 125.6 and looking at the limitation on subcontracting, because that's a huge regulation with a ton of information, will give you a little more information on how to kind of calculate those costs and how splitting the labor and whatnot goes. Great. We will jump to the next one. So yes, for profits and losses, the sub is typically paid on a predetermined basis. So something like a paid when paid, subcontractor will be paid 10 days after the government pays in full for the services covered by that section of the invoice, something to that extent. And again, you don't want to do profit splitting when it comes to prime sub teams. That's we'll talk about it a little later, but that's an indicator of affiliation and you don't want that. For the joint venture, you are actually creating a new legal entity. I'm sure you heard Jill mention unpopulated. Yes, it is an unpopulated legal entity, and we will talk about that in greater detail too. It's not, there's not a building for the joint venture typically with a bunch of people employed or anything like that, but it is legally a new entity, typically an LLC, and it must be registered in SAM. That's a big one. People always forget to register their joint venture in SAM, or they wait till the last minute. And there's a plethora of case law of the courts saying, too bad, you can't get this award if you're not in SAM. For the prime sub team, there is not a new legal entity created. The offerer is the prime. The prime is listed everywhere that the solicitation requests for an offerer's name. It is just that the sub is often also listed in the proposal somewhere as a prime, as a subcontractor, an identified subcontractor for the team. And we'll talk about that a little more when we get into the agreements. Finally, we talked just briefly about these, but subcontracting limitations. So you might think joint ventures, performance of work, and prime sub is subcontracting limitations. But actually, the joint venture is still subject to the subcontracting limitations, because I know it's a lot of different structures, but many joint ventures will also then subcontract some of their work. So it's important to keep in mind. I like to look at them as kind of, pie charts here, and you've got subcontracting limitations for the joint venture. You've got the joint venture has to perform, we'll say services, we'll stick with the theme, 50% of the work because it's a services contract. So the JV itself has to do half that pie, and it can subcontract to any entity at once for the other half. And then when you look at the prime sub team, you have the subcontracting limits apply only to the prime. So the prime makes up that 50%, has to do 50% of that work. And the subcontractor, now I'm noting similarly situated entity rule. We will talk about that more. But if it's a small business set aside and you've got a large business subcontractor, they're not similarly situated. So you can only give them 50%. So while those pie charts look about the same right now, you go back to the joint venture one, and then you do the performance of work. So you know that of that 50% the joint venture is doing, the small business or 8A or WOSB lead venturer has to actually perform 40% of the 50%. So in the end, if your goal is to create this great team, you are not capable of doing as much work as you'd like to. You're actually trying to kind of minimize your role and how much work you have to do. You can actually do that more with a joint venture, typically. If you're looking at the prime sub team, the only way to really get that percentage smaller is to have those similarly situated entities. So if it's a small business contract, you can subcontract some of the work to another small business, and that will count toward your side. But that's generally the way those are going to look. And there's a lot of complicated math in there again. So if you If you are interested in talking through that on a more detailed level, shoot me an email. We can do that. Okay, just an example of the differences in how they look. Small co and big corp forming new entity, big small LLC. The new legal entity registers in SAM. It will submit a bid in its own name in response to a federal government solicitation. So is this a joint venture or is this a prime sub team? Keywords: new entity, new legal entity, registered in SAM, bid will be in its own name. We're looking at a joint venture. Then this is the second example. Quick Dry intends to submit a bid on a government contract for dry cleaning services. Quick Dry agrees to subcontract laundry pickup to Trucks R Us. Here we're dealing with two separate agreements, a prime contract and then an additional subcontract for a section of those services. This would clearly be a prime subcontractor team. All right, just some really great big picture best practices for both. And these really are some pro tips. They're ones that may seem common sense, but if I could, boy, if everybody had this common sense, there'd be a lot less awards taken from people. So I promise you it's less common sense than you'd think. First off, use a specific agreement tailored to your individual situation. I am absolutely sympathetic to the small business plight in today's economy and the fact that it'd be great if you could just have templates. But that word is not one we use in my profession. It does not work well. I commonly have clients say, hey, can I just get a joint venture template and I can use it for all my joint ventures? I'm happy to do a contract with some fill in the blanks for you, but it is not a template. I am not certifying it is going to be the correct one for every work that you do. We'll talk a little bit about some horror stories later on, but for now, just keep in mind each solicitation is different. There's different limitations on subcontracting. There's different requirements. If you are familiar with the CIO SP4, that's a great example. I've never done more detailed and specifically tailored joint ventures and TAs in my life as I did for clients during that solicitation. So second one, consult with professional resources as needed. Again, these are tough rules. I have an entire career of just digging into these rules, the FAR, the SBA rules, a few federal statutes, and I am learning something new every day. Do not be ashamed. A lot of, small business owners think, oh, I can read these rules. These rules are often written in a way that are just not easy to read, not easy to interpret. There's plenty of cases out there with differing opinions of courts of people that do this. So again, reach out for help if you need it. Take the time to carefully read your drafts and source documents. Again, the CIO SP4 was a great example. There were so many sneaky requirements in that solicitation, and not even difficult ones, but ones that if somebody were to protest your bid on it, that if you didn't, for example, specifically lay out calling the managing venture or the lead member and things like that, they potentially could be seen as non-compliant, as it very clearly stated you needed to assign a lead venturer. Things like that. I think it was the lead team member is what it was called. Also, ensuring compliance with applicable regulations. This just goes with everything I've been harping on. Negotiate the best possible deal with your teammate. This is another one. So yes, joint ventures are very set by regulations. TAs and subcontracts are not. There's very little guidance in the rules on how to draft those. But regardless, there should be just a certain amount of bilateral provisions, things that protect both people. And of course, when I am representing my client, I'm zealously representing my client, and that's whose rights I'm worried about. But as much as possible, I'm going to advise that things are fair and bilateral and protecting everyone's rights. I'm always going, even if my client is the prime, I'm always going to tell them to put that pass-through clause in there. You don't want to leave a subcontractor hanging with no recourse. You just want to make sure that everybody's rights are protected. It's very important to have counsel on both sides if at all possible. These are big, don't dust off an unedited commercial contract for the reasons I just said, and we will talk more about that later. But commercial contracts may look great. They may be strong contracts for two commercial companies that are not doing government work. Government work is an entirely separate beast, as you are probably aware, and it is not one that these work for. And you could lose awards, or far worse, you could even get in bigger trouble for something like that. Rely blindly on a teammate's template or an internet template. Same thing. Hate the word template. We don't use it. We don't provide them. We don't advise you looking at them. I would say the one exception would be SBA's mentor protege agreement template, because it is an official SBA template that's out there. And even then, you should always have experienced counsel or at least an experienced resource helping you with the actual substance of the agreement. But that is a good one to start your agreement with. Otherwise, I think there's some joint venture templates floating around from SBA from years and years and years ago. Don't use them. Not a good idea. Not going to get done what you need done. Don't be afraid to negotiate even with a large business. Again, a lot of times you won't see that pass-through clause, or you won't see certain things in there that are very standard or absolutely necessary to protect your rights, especially in the prime sub relationships. I feel like we have a lot of clients come to us and say, hey, we're newer, we're the prime here, but we got this large business sub. They gave us this subcontract. It seems a little harsh. And a lot of times it is. And I'm not knocking large businesses here, but they have a lot of legal counsel they spend a lot of money on. And a lot of times, if you don't know your rights and you don't know what's standard here, you sign one of these and really, really leave yourself in trouble, not just with your own rights and recourses, but it can also lead to some issues with there being a sensible subcontractor affiliation. Again, we'll talk more later on that. Relying on handshakes or oral deals. Obviously, everything should be in writing. I don't think I need to explain that. That is just a basic legal principle. Assume your teammate has your best interests in mind. I think I covered that one as well. You want to assume that your teammate is looking out for themselves. And even if you are very amicable, I can't tell you how many times I've had clients say, no, we've been working them forever. We're great. We're a great team. Yes, but at least working things out ahead of time prevents you from having those big disputes later on where something is not established right off the bat. For example, what Jill mentioned, who's going to be paid what, what are the rates for each personnel and who's providing which personnel. Those are great to work out the minute you can. And then assume your teammate knows what the heck it's doing. Just rule of thumb, don't assume anybody knows what the heck they're doing unless they are an expert in the field of federal government contracting. It goes for other law firms as well. As much as I love working with other law firms and love when I have my clients tell me, hey, we have an agreement written by our general counsel. We think it's really good. I hate to tell them it may be good for commercial work, but we're going to need to fix it for Fed contracting. Good, scary example, just to really, hound in those points. Quick Dry and Trucks R Us from a joint venture to pursue an SDVOSB set aside. That's a service disabled veteran owned set aside contract. Quick Dry, the SDVOSB, wants to save some money, so it drafts the JV agreement itself. It found an 8A template on an archived SBA website. Template is outdated for the wrong program. Although the JV is awarded the contract, the award is terminated following a competitor's successful SDVOSB protest. This is based on a real case. So they wrote a JV, sounds similar, and I can tell you it's probably be pretty rough to lose this award looking at an 8A versus an SDVOSB joint venture because they're going to be very similar. But it's those little details that can be just enough. So if a unsuccessful offer says, hey, I'm protesting this, I don't think their joint venture is going to follow the rules, I don't think it's eligible, and a deeper dive into it shows it's not, you can lose that award. Another one, Quick Dry intends to subcontract a portion of a set-aside contract to Big Corp. Big Corp sends Quick Dry its standard TA, written on Big Corp letterhead. The TA includes many provisions very favorable to Big Corp, including the ability for Big Corp, but not Quick Dry, to terminate the relationship without cause. Too scared to negotiate against this large prime, Quick Dry signs the agreement as is. After the team is awarded the contract, a competitor files a size protest. SBA holds that the team is in violation of the ostensible subcontractor affiliation rule. This is based on the subcontractor-friendly provisions of the TA. So as I mentioned, not only could this poor small business sub be in trouble because its rights aren't protected, there may not be a pass-through, it can't terminate, but the prime can at any time. But in addition to that, the SBA could look at this and say, we think really the sub's going to be kind of the main one doing the work here and not the prime. And it can be something that they say violates the ostensible subcontractor affiliation rule. All right, So good little big picture comparison. We will dive a little deeper now into joint ventures and then, as I said, prime sub teams. All right, the form and registration of a joint venture. So again, SBA's rules have just a few requirements and they're all different. So one that is just universal to all joint venture agreements is they all must be in writing. Typically, this is done by way of a joint venture agreement. We will talk a little more about when you actually don't need to worry about the format, but for now, keep in mind, needs to be in writing. Generally, that's going to be a JVA, a joint venture agreement. And then the other thing that is a hard absolute for all JVs, they must register in SAM. This means the JV must have, oh, and I'm sorry, that says DUNS. It should say a unique entity identifier as we're switching to that. So the EIN through the IRS, and then also a unique entity identifier. The JV is going to need its own. Those are not of the two venturers. That is the JV's own. So when you're setting up a JV, you're going to need to get those things in place. And all of that needs to be done before you start bidding on work. And then again, in SAM, you're going to need to identify the entity as a joint venture as well. Okay, unpopulated. We threw this word around a little. What does it mean? Joint venture is formed as a separate legal entity and it must be unpopulated. This is actually a change. There used to be the ability to have some populated joint ventures, but the rules now say they all must be unpopulated. So it means you cannot populate the joint venture with a bunch of personnel that are intended to perform the joint venture's contracts. The only exception to this, the JV can have a few of its own separate employees strictly for administrative functions. This is often a facility security officer. And the reason is, that can depend so heavily on what type of contract it is on the solicitation itself. It may not be something the joint venture needs for multiple contracts, just the one. So that is okay to employ one of those for the joint venture. Otherwise, it is not a new payroll. It is not a new entity that's paying these individuals, all working under this separate entity. It is just the personnel and resources of the venturers themselves, and the joint venture pays each venturer and the venturers pay their personnel. Number of venturers. So most SBA rules joint ventures. I say that because generally you can form joint ventures that are not, for small business set asides. They're not for any kind of set aside. They're just two companies venturing together, and those can be pretty much, whatever they want to be. But that's not really the subject of today, but they are out there. So keep in mind if somebody tells you, oh, it's a joint venture, but it's not an SBA rules joint venture, that none of this is going to apply to them. So for most of those, it's only two members. Now, except for the mentor protege, so we'll talk about those, but mentor protege JVs, which can only consist of the mentor and protege, except for those, there isn't a hard limit. And I have, in fact, worked on joint ventures with 3 to 5 participants. In fact, that CIO SP4 was such a huge solicitation. I helped multiple companies form 3, 4, 5 party joint ventures. So the more the better for some of those. You want to still make sure everybody's got counsel, everybody's rights are protected. But if it's a giant contract and you need that many venturers to perform it, power to you. This is a big area of misunderstanding that we commonly see. So this is the 2-year rule. And the important thing, I think the most complicated part, is that when you start this 2-year rule and when you end this 2-year rule are based on different things. So keep in mind, when you start it is based on the first award. So the first award of a contract to the joint venture. I always tell my clients, congratulations, you got your first award as a joint venture, pop a bottle of champagne, do what you need to do, but then go to your contract, go to your calendar, mark your contract down, mark the day that you were awarded that contract, flip to 2 years later and mark that day too. And after that day, you cannot bid on any more work. You can bid on an unlimited number of contracts during that time. You can go bid crazy. You can bid daily for those 2 years if you want, but you cannot bid. So the day starts, the first day starts based on the award. And then what that is then restricting is your bid. So keep that in mind. It is not restricting the awards themselves. You can get tons of awards after that point. And I'm sure you're aware, plenty of awards, they do take years and years for an award to be made. So you can accept any awards from anything you bid during that 2-year. So say you get an award 2 days after, that's fine. But You can't bid anything else after that point. So the SBA did eliminate the 3 contract limit. Thank goodness. That was such a tough rule for companies to abide by. That one had said you can only do 3 contracts in 2 years, but we found that it was just requiring venturers to go out and repeatedly do new contracts, new joint venture agreements with each other to try to get around it. So we'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. But anyways, once the 2-year window closes, JV should stop bidding. Now, no one's going to stop you from bidding. You're not going to have a big red mark on your bid that says, oh, it's been 2 years. What you do risk once you bid past the 2-year mark is affiliation. The protection from affiliation only lasts for that 2-year period for bids. So as I mentioned, the rule is easily circumvented. You just form a new joint venture entity. And this was a lot more common when we had the 3 and 2 rule, because the rule is specific to a joint venture entity itself, not to the partners. It's not saying you cannot work, partner A and partner B cannot work together for more than 2 years. It is only saying that joint venture entity, AB LLC, cannot bid past the 2-year point. So they just go ahead and do, AB2 LLC or whatever it may be. And this is an example of a case, the Quality Services International, where actually over a 4-year period, the partners formed 8 joint ventures and they were awarded 15 contracts. So this one goes back to the 3 and 2 rule, but there was not a violation because none of the joint ventures received more than 3 contracts over a 2-year period. So that is how venturers get around that. SBA does say at some point too much joint venturing could lead to affiliation, but they have not told us what that too much means. So, be careful. Don't do so many joint ventures with one party that you are risking some kind of affiliation there. And that is, of course, unless you have a mentor protege in place, which will shield you from that affiliation. But we're not sure exactly what that magic number is. Small business requirements. So how does the joint venture qualify as small? So it qualifies as long as each member of the JV individually, keyword underlined for a reason, individually, they must fall below the applicable size standard. This is not the way the rules used to look. There used to be a rule that said you would add the venture sizes together. Now that is only what you would do if the 2-year rule was violated or something where affiliation was found. Then you would add sizes together. But other than that, the JV rules and the small business requirements allow you to just look at the sizes individually. So the only way to have a joint venture then between a large and a small business, because clearly in that case, the large and small would not individually fall below the contract size standard, would be to have that mentor protege agreement. And we will dive into that one as well. Quick Dry is a good example here. Quick Dry has 5 million in average receipts. Slow Dry has 4 million. They form a JV, Quick and Slow. The JV will pursue a contract under NAICS code 812320. The corresponding size standard is 6 million. So here, if you added those together, which is not what we're going to do, if you added those together, you'd be at 9 million. So it would not be, it wouldn't be eligible. So an ineligible JV here, a JV that's not written correctly or one that bids over the 2 years would not be eligible for this work. But a proper JV, you would look at their sizes individually, 5 and 4 million. So a proper JV is eligible because both members are under 6 million. So here's another example. Quick Dry, again, 5 million in annual receipts, forms a second joint venture, this time with Trucks R Us. Trucks R Us is a bigger company. They've got 25 million in average receipts. The JV then wants to pursue a small business set aside under that same NAICS code, so $6 million size standard. So here, unless there is an approved SBA mentor protege agreement in place, because we have one that is large for the size standard and one that is small, it's going to be ineligible because one member exceeds it. Now we will talk about how that mentor protege exception works. I believe that's the next slide. But if there's not one of those in place, it's out of luck. You cannot form a JV here and compete for that work. You could compete for other work, perhaps a construction contract with a $39 million size standard, but you're not going to be able to compete for that $6 million work. Yes, mentor protege exception. So this is a big one. The SBA approved mentor protege JV may joint venture for any federal procurement for which the protege qualifies as small. And this is regardless of the mentor size. You could have a Microsoft mentor. It doesn't matter. It is all about what the protege qualifies for. But this is, again, SBA approved, and that is very important. SBA needs to approve the mentor protege agreement before the parties can joint venture for this work and qualify for this exception. SBA used to have to approve all 8A contracts, all 8A joint venture agreements, and it no longer has to do that, but SBA still must pre-approve a joint venture agreement for 8A sole source contracts. So that's listed here because it's important to keep in mind if you've got an 8A company and a large business, and you guys are looking at an 8A contract, you've got two levels of approval you need to get first. You need to get your mentor protege agreement approved. Once that approved, you are going to need to get your mentor protege joint venture agreement approved to get any sole source 8A work. And then what requirements they're going to have to meet, that's going to depend on the solicitation socioeconomic set aside. So if, again, 8A, we'll take the example here, the contract is set aside for 8A, then you're going to need to meet those 8A requirements as a mentor protege joint venture agreement. And then just a note here, the 8A and all small mentor protege programs have officially been consolidated by the SBA in the last few years. This is nice. Now we have one set of program rules, 125.9, I believe, and they govern all types of mentor protege agreements. And there was kind of a silly overlap between the two. So I'm really glad SBA took that consolidation move in the last couple of years. So contrary to a popular misconception, a mentor protege agreement is not required if both parties are small. So we already talked about this, but just to hound that point in, the only time you need, and keyword is need a mentor protege agreement is if you have a small and large business wanting to go after the small work, or an 8A and large business wanting to go after the 8A work, etc. If both companies are small for the size standard, like that first example, you don't need a mentor protege agreement. And I say need because there's still other reasons to do one. And usually you see the mentor protege agreement between a large and small business. But I've also seen larger small businesses do mentorship to a brand new small business because they want to provide other resources and assistance. They want to help them with things. They want to do other things that would raise flags and potentially cause affiliation, and they want to be protected from it. So that is another great reason to do a mentor protege agreement. But you don't need to go out and do one and get it approved if both parties are small and want to joint venture for that work. So another popular misconception that I see a lot of, and there's a reason this presentation talks about two types of teams and mentor protege is not actually listed. Because a mentor protege agreement does not establish a contracting entity. You cannot just say, great, thanks SBA, you approved my mentor protege agreement, and now we are mentor protege team and we're going to bid on this work. That's not how that works. The agency will ask you, wait, are you bidding as a prime sub? Is the mentor going to be the sub? Is the prime going to be the protege? Or are you bidding as a joint venture? Do you have a joint venture agreement? So you don't have just an automatic contracting entity. You have a relationship. That is what you have. The mentor protege is not registered in SAM. You know, there's a list on SBA's website of active mentor protege relationships, but you're not a team. Again, you can't just go bid. You can't just say, hey, we're bidding for this relationship. And then you are going to need SBA's approval before a joint venture can be formed that qualifies for this exception. Again, you get that mentor protege agreement approved, and then you can joint venture and qualify for the exception. So once SBA approves a mentor protege relationship, the parties then execute the separate joint venture agreements. And it's plural because you can execute as many as you want, and you can also bid as prime sub teams and things like that. And then you are a proper mentor protege team, but you have to qualify as either a joint venture or a prime sub. You can't just be a mentor protege relationship team. So this is going to, the next couple slides are going to apply to both regular joint ventures and mentor protege joint ventures. So when I say lead member in the situation where you have a mentor protege agreement underlying the JV, the lead member is going to be the protege. Keep that in mind because I mentioned earlier that the protege is the one you get to piggyback off of everything. So that is the one that's going to be the lead. So for a joint venture to pursue, And 8A, service disabled veteran, veteran owned, women owned, economically disadvantaged women owned, or hub zone contract. The JV's lead member needs to hold the appropriate socioeconomic certification or self-certification. I don't think there's many self-certifications left, but we'll leave that in there. So that would be, again, the protege, or the one, if it's a regular small business joint venture with a small business and a hub zone, it would need to be the hub zone. If it's a small business and an 8A, it would need to be the 8A. And of course, this depends on the work you're going after. You can have these statuses and then just pursue small business work, in which case either small business could lead. But if you are pursuing these set asides, whatever the contract is set aside for, that's who needs to be your lead member. We also don't recommend any flip-flopping. So if you have a relationship, let's say you have an 8A company venturing with a WOSV company, and you guys want to pursue both 8A and WOSV work. This question comes up all the time. Can we just flip-flop? Can we say, okay, the 8A company is going to lead this contract, the WOSV is going to lead this contract? We do not recommend it. There's a lot of potential issues with that, and it can lead to raise an eyebrow for affiliation or something like that. So we would recommend the parties actually execute 2 separate joint venture agreements: an 8A joint venture agreement compliant with all the 8A rules, and a WOSV agreement that is compliant with all the WSV JV rules. In which case the WSV would be the lead in all of the WSV JV, and the 8A would lead all the 8A JV.
Nicole, we have a question.
Yep.
In this Bruce Tabachink, is a JV agreement also required if an unsolicited proposal is proposed to a government agency? This question is related specifically to the United States Postal Service submitting an unsolicited proposal. I
am not sure I follow. So the Postal Service,
they're wanting to submit an unsolicited proposal to the USPS.
Okay.
Yeah, would a JV agreement be required?
So the question simply comes down to whether it is a direct and sole source award or whether there is any competition. So if there is some kind of solicitation out there and it calls for any type of competition, even if no one else bids, but it is a competition, then that's not a sole source award. That is a competitive award. If there is nothing solicited and you are simply saying, hey, there's no solicitation, we would like to do the following work, and the agency says yes, without any kind of competition here, without putting out offers or requests for offers, requests for bids, or anything sources sought, we are just going to directly make this award to you, and that is an 8A award, then that would be considered a sole source 8A award, and a JV would need approval from SBA beforehand.
So if I can just interject, my name is Bruce Tabachnik. I posted the question. We have patents for our product. This is a technology product that we believe can help U.S. Postal Service reduce their cost of operation. So we have exclusive patents for this type of product. So does it mean we have no competition, or we still need to?
My take on this would be, if you needed to partner with someone else to perform the work that you are submitting the unsolicited proposal on, like if you're going to have an established team, if it's not just your business.
Well, we're looking for maybe a contractor to U.S. Postal Service, because we don't have experience in bidding on anything or filing any documents. So that's the interest for us to maybe partner with existing suppliers, or in the technology area, not specifically for this product, but in the technology area, where we can then propose this type of proposal using the right approach.
Sure. So are you an 8A firm then?
We are Hub Zone certified and veteran business.
Sure. So the only ones that need the only joint venture agreements that the SBA needs to approve are the 8A sole source. So if it's not an 8A award, and that's a simple question for the agency, typically you have the solicitation to look at. It's going to tell you whether it's 8A, whether it's competitive, whether it's sole source or direct award. If you don't have a solicitation to look at, you absolutely have to clarify with the agency. What type of award are you making here? What is it set aside for? Is it 8A? Is it competitive? But if you're not 8A, if you found another 8A firm and the agency wanted to make a direct 8A award to you all, then yes, you would need to make sure your 8A joint venture agreement was approved. Otherwise, no other joint venture agreement needs to be approved ahead of time.
Mhm. So it means I need to find a partner or 8A firm would be preferable. Is that?
Well, I think that if it's an unsolicited proposal, you're presenting the idea to the USPS.
Correct. It's a product. It's a product deployed in the marketplace. We just feel that that will help U.S. Postal Service reduce their cost of operation. It's a technology product. It's a business-to-business product, and we have exclusive patents for this product. So I don't know if there is other competition for this.
Sure. So if I think I see what Jill's getting at too. If you're presenting this to the agency, then you actually probably wouldn't want to suggest that it's 8A since you are not 8A. You would want to suggest they count it toward hub zone, or I think you said SDVOSB, one of those quotas. Let them know, hey, this is what I qualify as. You can give me this work and you can count it as hub zone. And that's the way I would present that. I can't give you legal advice here, but that's how I would present that if it were me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and also if whatever you're proposing to the USPS, it's something that you would need a partner for, that's when you would form the joint venture agreement. If your business could perform that work on its own, then, the joint venture agreement may not be necessary.
So then I probably have to partner with large firm that already supplier to the U.S. Postal Service, because yes, I need this help. We cannot deliver on our own the solution to large entity like U.S. Postal Service. So so then we need also the mentor protege
Yes.
agreement then. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
And that one you would have to get approved. But if you find someone that's a large company willing to work with you that has that experience, you guys get a mentor protege agreement sent off to SBA and get that approved. Then you can do joint ventures with them. You can do prime sub relationships with them. You can do whatever you need to do to accomplish those.
But because it's unsolicited, there is no a limitation on the amounts of revenue or
well, not necessarily. That's why you need to talk to the contracting officer. Even unsolicited work, if the contracting officer tells you, we're going to execute a contract with you, you need to find out whether that contract is being considered set aside dollars or not. If they say, yeah, we're going to execute a contract with you and it's completely unrestricted, then you don't even need that mentor protege agreement. You can partner with your large business. It's a large business contract. That's just fine. So it's all going to be up to the agency. You have to ask the agency, are these set aside dollars? Are these 8A dollars? Are these, clearly probably not 8A because again, you're not 8A, but are they hub zone dollars? Are you going to count this toward hub zone? If yes, then you need either a mentor protege agreement or another small business, and you need to follow all of the rules to make sure those hub zone dollars are going where they're supposed to go.
One last question. Since it's unsolicited proposal and I find a partner, do we need to first propose it to the U.S. Postal Service in this case and see if they might be interested, only then file the JV and mentor protege proposals? Or we need those agreements first put in place before we present the proposal to the U.S. Postal Service, let's say?
And I will defer to Jill on that one. To me, that's going to be just a business
I would
call.
It's an awful lot of work to form a formal joint venture agreement and a formal mentor protege.
And very costly as well. So yeah.
Well, for an unsolicited proposal where you're not certain that the USPS would be interested in purchasing it or not, or they may be, but they don't have the correct dollars allocated for it. I would say unsolicited proposals are risky because the government is risk averse. I would recommend just mapping out what you're planning on doing, how you would execute it. The other thing I want to, if the government were to go ahead and issue a proposal, they would have to assign it an NAICS code. And then
Right.
that NAICS code would be whether or not it is a small business or not a small business. So if you're partnering with a large business, the assumption, and the size standards are fairly high for services and manufacturing, but it's just a totally different road for unsolicited proposals.
Mhm.
I would wait if the USPS or another government agency says, yes, we're interested, then maybe consider going down the road of mentor protege JV. That takes months of preparation to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate the information. Thanks.
Yep.
All right. So a properly structured joint venture agreement is going to piggyback on the status of the lead member. And again, on the status of the protege, if this is a mentor protege joint venture. So whatever that lead venture qualifies as, the JV itself, again, if properly structured, will qualify for that as well. So again, must be structured properly to allow the lead member to control and to have the appropriate benefits. So this is really important. This is the entire policy behind putting all of these rules on this type of team, which is that the government doesn't want to say, hey, these are $8. We're going to give you an 8A contract, even though you are a joint venture mixed of an 8A and a small business, and then have that 8A pretty much just sit there and pass along the work, the benefits and the profits to the small business. The JV needs to give, I mean, we'll go into this, but at least 40% of the work needs to be done by the 8A in that situation. And that needs to be more than administrative. It needs to be real work. They need to gain the experience. They need to be entitled to a certain amount of the profits, 40% in that case, if you are doing 40% of the work. But the whole goal here is to not have that pass-through structure. And that's really important with the mentor protege agreements as well. If you have an 8A protege and a large business mentor, and they are doing these joint ventures, the last thing the agencies want is to check the 8A box and say, great, this is 8A work, we're supporting 8As. And really the large business is doing all the work and collecting all the money. So that is not the goal there. Can I move my slides? There we go. Joint venture agreements. So this is the agreements themselves, and this is some big picture thoughts on these. All JVs need to be in writing. We talked about that, in writing and in SAM. Those are the two. Just keep those in your head, no matter what you're doing for your joint venture agreement, in writing, in SAM. But most JVs also need to include a long list of mandatory provisions. These required provisions are going to be based on the socioeconomic status of the solicitation the JV is pursuing. In the case of unsolicited work, it will depend on the contract itself. So if it's a direct award, you look at the contract. If it's a competitive solicitation, you look at the solicitation, you see what the socioeconomic set aside is. And it's important that these vary. This goes to that example I mentioned earlier where we had the SDVOSB JV trying to use an 8A JV. These provisions are going to look painfully similar, but there are differences. So you cannot just assume that your 8A JV is going to work for your SDVOSB. You need to go to the contract, go to the solicitation, find out what it's set aside for. That, say it's an SDVOSB, that SDVOSB then venture needs to be the lead, needs to collect the benefits, the certain amount of work, the profits that are required under the rules. And those are the rules that are going to apply to that JV. So if all JV partners are small businesses, this is kind of the big exception here. And the JV is only pursuing small business set asides. So none of the 8A, SDVOSB, WSB stuff we talked about. This is two small business partners, and the JV is only pursuing small business set asides. The JV does not need to include any specific terms. Again, still in writing, again, still in SAM, but it doesn't have to have, the special bank account and all the things we're going to talk about in a few that all the other JVs need to have. Instead, it just needs to be in writing of some sort, signed, and needs to be in SAM. Here is where all the mandatory provisions are located. I'm not going to waste my breath on reading off these rules here. You can check them out. Generally, my go-to is just going to Google and typing SDVOSB joint venture, and it will usually pop up. I love the Cornell sites, the ones that just take you straight to the free rules, and that would bring up 125.18. Again, these are all different. They're going to read painfully similar, but don't get bogged down as you start reading them thinking, oh, these ones are the same. These are all the same, because there are differences that are just so cleverly scattered in these rules that could be the difference between a successful award and a loss of an award. All right. Unique socioeconomic requirements. I did not want to go through all of these, but here's a couple of the small differences that can be a big deal. So most joint ventures don't require any SBA prior approval. Keep in mind, if you have that mentor protege agreement underlying it, that does require SBA approval, but the JVA itself, even a mentor protege JVA, does not typically require SBA's approval. But SBA must separately approve an 8A joint venture for the 8A sole source contracts. We've already talked about this one, but it's so important to keep in mind, because if you didn't get your 8A JV approved, you could then have a loss of an award if you were to have an 8A sole source contract offered to you. SBA will review a joint venture agreement in a size or eligibility protest. That's also important to keep in mind. We have a lot of clients think, well, I don't have to get this approved, so it doesn't need to be, amazing. Don't spend too much time on it. And again, if that were to be protested, you would want the best, perfect, most proper JV you can find, so you do not lose that award. So you might as well treat every JVA as if you are going to be having it reviewed by at least SBA, if not also the agency, which is usually the case. You'll have to submit for the agency. And then for VA, SDVOSB, or VOSB set-aside contracts only, the JV itself needs to also be separately verified by VA's CVE, all underlined here, before proposal submission. This is a very big one that seems to cause a lot of grief for some reason. So that's only for VA work, and it is for only the SDVOSB and VOSB set-asides. But if you are going after VA work, you are an SDVOSB joint venture, you have to be verified by VA's CVE. This is not the big extensive verification process that the SDVOSB venture has already gone through, where they submit a ton of documents and it's back and forth and it's arguing about hours and things like that. It is simply, look, VA, we have two ventures. We have a valid joint venture agreement. The lead venture is an SDVOSB. You should also list us in VIP as an SDVOSB joint venture, and CVE typically has no issue doing so. I have not had any clients denied on that basis or anything, but it's still a huge step that must be done, or you can't be eligible for those awards. Here are just some additional provisions that we suggest strongly that every joint venture agreement should include. And this is even those joint venture agreements that are only between small businesses and only for small business set-asides that don't need to have all the required provisions in them. You should still always at least consider including the following: dispute resolution. Are the parties going to do arbitration or mediation? We're going to go straight to litigation? Are we going to waive rights to trials by jury? I mean, all sorts of things that should be considered ahead of time so the parties know what their rights are in the event there is a dispute. My go-to is something along the lines of, the parties will work amicably and in good faith to try to resolve any disputes. And if such can't be accomplished, you will have mediation or arbitration. Generally, because joint ventures are so dictated by the rules, we don't see huge disputes. And I'm saying generally, they are very possible, but generally you see more smaller disputes. For example, as Jill mentioned, hey, this party has this personnel that costs this much. We think they're paying them too much from the JV's profit, something like that extent. That would be a simple dispute resolution that they should be able to work through. Shouldn't be a huge deal breaker for the parties' amicable relationship. Subcontracting. How are the parties going to subcontract? Is the JV going to jointly decide on the subcontractors? I've also seen situations where each JV party each of the venturers can subcontract on their own. In those situations, I just strongly caution that everybody's working together on those calculations, so you are not subcontracting out more than you should. It's an easier calculation when the joint venture itself is subcontracting out to these parties and everyone's working together. But if Each JV has their own subs they want to work with. That is just fine, as long as you are making sure, you've got that pie chart and you've got the division of work the way it needs to be in order to meet those limitations. Distributions. When is the joint venture making distributions, monthly, quarterly, etc.? And who's deciding on the amount of those distributions? Be careful here. It should be the lead venturer, but sometimes you'll see something like the parties will work together to determine the amount, and then the lead venturer will have final say. Dissolution of the JV. How is it going to look? How are assets going to be? The JV itself should not have a lot of assets, but certain equipment, things like that. Generally, everything stays with the party that provides it. If party A is providing a, skid steer and party B is providing a bunch of concrete, then, they each keep their materials when it dissolves, but it's still really good to go ahead and sort all that out ahead of time. Capital contributions. Sorry. Generally, you just see a very small amount because joint ventures are unpopulated and they're not out there needing to buy a ton of their own equipment or pay their own personnel. You'll see something like $1,000, and that does need to be divided in the 51-49 split. There is a requirement in the rules for any kind of socioeconomic or small business joint venture that the small business, the lead venturer, or the one that qualifies for the socioeconomic status has 51% ownership. Capital contributions are the way to demonstrate that ownership. So generally you would see, hey, the 8A protege firm has 51 or is contributing, $510, and the large business mentor is contributing $490. Comes out to $1,000. That's the capital contributions, but you do need to establish that. Even I've seen people literally do $100 before, but whatever you do there, you could do 10,000 if you want to be safe and make sure there's a big operating account. Up to you, but make sure you know what it is. Splitting of losses, already talked about that one. Rules dictate profits. Generally, you keep losses fair, but again, that is not set by the rules. You can do that however you'd like. Taxes. Typically you have like a tax member. One of the venturers has a tax member that makes sure everything's paid. Typically should be the lead. Again, if you had a good argument as to why this is maybe an administrative personnel or something like that, you might be able to throw that in there. And then indemnity, just a great clause to make sure you put in every single agreement for teaming and federal contracts, just to make sure you're protecting everybody's rights. Other JV legal matters. So 40% of the work, we talked about this, must be done by the 8A member for an 8A JV, small business for a small business joint venture, hub zone for a hub zone joint venture. It's going to depend on the solicitation. 40% number is a floor, not a ceiling. You can absolutely say the 8A venturer is actually the one more qualified to perform this work. They're bidding with, say, a small business venture, and the 8A member wants to do 80% of the work. That's just fine. As long as you meet the 40%, it is again a floor, not a ceiling. The work performed by the appropriate entity or entities must be more than administrative or ministerial functions. So I mentioned this earlier. This is just to make sure you don't have the 8A saying, yeah, we're doing 40% of the work, but what that is us basically handing papers and establishing just administrative things, registrations, and giving all the actual labor to the large business, the large business venturer. And then what is work? We also touched on this earlier. SBA uses the same formulas for calculating compliance with the limitation on subcontracting. Again, 13 CFR 125.6. This seems like a silly question, but it's actually one of the most common ones. Funny enough, it's one I can't help a lot with. My clients often come to me and say, hey, we're doing this big IT contract. What is considered the work that we need to divide up here? Frankly, I can help you look at the solicitation. I can help you look at the limitations on subcontracting formulas, and we can talk about how to calculate it, but it's really going to come down to you and the know-how. You're the one performing the work. What are the personnel you need? What are the resources you need? How many hours are they spending? All of that, those calculations are again in that rule, but you use those to calculate the work that's being done and then divide it up accordingly. This is a one that we see actually kind of hangs up a lot of joint ventures that would otherwise be compliant. You need to be really careful about the minority JV's veto rights. So the minority member of the JV, sorry. If a joint venture is seeking an 8A, SDVOSB, or another socioeconomic set-aside contract, the lead venture not only needs to own 51% and needs to be established as the lead, but they also have to have that actual control and that power to control. That is a very important requirement. There was a case back in 2020 called Seventh Dimension. It was a big, big decision. SVA said that it wants the SDVOSB member of the SDVOSB JV to have unequivocal control. That is full control. That is the non-lead venturer cannot say, no, let's not do that distribution, or no, let's not use that subcontractor. It has to be full control. Now, SBA did dial back on this a little, but it is important to keep it in mind. It wasn't overruled. SBA's new rule did not just X out this case. It's still there. And part of our role as attorneys is to, work in that gray area. So you've got a hard line here at Seventh Dimension for unequivocal control. And then you've got SBA's new rules, which they say the minority venturer can participate in corporate governance decisions as is commercially customary. Perfect, right? No questions. What is commercially customary? I don't know. It's going to depend on the industry. It's going to depend on the contract. If you can make a good argument for why, I don't want to give you too many examples here because it is very difficult. It is very gray area. We don't know for sure, but something like the minority venturer may have some say in whether or not the lead venturer is just going to dissolve the joint venture. We're just going to get rid of the JV and stop, we're not going to bid on any more work. That may be something that you would say, hey, in a typical company, the minority owner, even if they own a small share, should have some say in just dissolving everything. So that would be one example that I do think would qualify as commercially customary. Another JV legal matter, past performance. So when evaluating the capabilities of the joint venture itself, the past performance of the joint venture, the business systems and certifications, the procuring agency must consider the qualifications of the members, not just the JV itself. This makes perfect sense if you think about it. JVs are formed newly all the time. You bid on a work, two experienced companies go bid on a contract. The agency can't say, oh, hey, AB LLC, this joint venture has never performed this work before, so 0 past performance. That's not allowed. They have to say company A has great experience here, company B has great experience here. We're going to add those. How they really add or average those, that becomes a bit more subjective, but they do have to at least consider those. And this is part of the SBA's 5 program specific JV regulations. You'll find this in all of those, the listed rules I had earlier for WSBs and SDVOSBs and all of those. Now, some COs are not familiar with the SBA rules. I already mentioned that. Some don't even think they apply. Do not be afraid to politely let them know. We have filed protests on this basis more times than I'm pretty surprised at how many times we've had to do this, where we point directly to the rules and say, hey, you said we have 0 past performance, but you are required to consider the past performance of both venturers.
Nicole, I just want to interject how much I'm enjoying this because those of you that don't know, I work primarily with 8A firms, and all the things that you're mentioning are things that come up again and again. And
Good.
With 13 CFR, that is the regulating body for the small business programs, and
Yeah.
it doesn't always agree with the FAR.
Yeah,
So,
it doesn't.
firms are having to educate
Right.
the contracting officers.
And now you see why I had a hard time cutting these slides down because
Yeah,
I
there's a lot, but I don't want to scare anyone away. I can't even begin to express how important this information is, especially when you're getting farther into government contracting and you're becoming more involved with submitting proposals, and that you could increase your capacity by teaming. I've seen relationships work out very well, and I've seen them really not work out well at all. And
right.
the difference is in the preparation ahead of time.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jill.
Yeah.
So I think this is one of our last slides for JVs, and then we'll promptly move right into the other type of team. Security clearances. This is a newer rule as well. When a JV is going to perform cleared work, the CO has to accept the clearances of the members. It does not need to, it can't require a separate security clearance for the joint venture itself. This has to do with it being unpopulated. And this question does come up a lot. Now, this is not a license for the JV to say, oh, well, our lead venturer has the clearance, so we're fine. You don't get to do that. Both companies need to be cleared, but because it's unpopulated JV and it's going to be the resources and personnel and facilities of those venturers, as long as they're both cleared, the company is good. The joint venture company is good. All right, prime sub teams. So what is a subcontract? Seems pretty easy. It's not. It's very broadly defined. You can find some guidance in FAR. There's also statutes and SBA rules. They all have a little bit of different definitions. So go as broad as you can when you are considering what a subcontract is. The FAR says a subcontract is a contract entered into by a prime or a subcontractor for the purpose of obtaining supplies, materials, equipment, or services of any kind under a prime contract. This is such an important definition. How often do I have people say, no, this is just a 1099. This is just a vendor contract. It's just a consultant, not a subcontractor. I don't need to worry about the rules. I don't need to worry about the limitations on subcontracting. That is debatable. You need to make sure under your contract, under your prime contract, that does not qualify as a subcontract, because I'm going to say most of the time, it says maybe, but most of the time, those are going to qualify as subcontractors. I could go on forever on this topic, but the few exceptions that I have found based on case law are things like you have a consultant that works very long-term for your company, is not consulting on specific prime contracts, but rather something like, employee retention or something to that extent. And you can make that argument. This is not a section of the prime contract work. This is a longer term. Again, we could go on forever talking about those cases. Big picture, if it is a section, if it can be considered any part of the work under a prime contract that you are then contracting with another entity to do, to advise on, to help with, it's probably a subcontract. All right, the buck stops at the prime. We talked about this already a little, so I won't harp too long. The prime is 100% responsible for the prime contract. Subcontractor walks off the job, defaults, goes bankrupt, goes crazy and tears up the entire work site. It's not going to be an excuse legally for not completing the project. Now, there's no reason to not be very upfront with your CO if you are a prime that is getting, a lot of issues with the sub, letting them know this is what's going on. We realize we are the one that is responsible, but we wanted to give you a heads up. That's fine. But generally, the agency is not going to say, oh, no, you're fine. You're going through all that. They're going to say, you are the one that is responsible to us. You did a bad job picking your sub. Sorry. So the prime can be held accountable for even the subcontractor's violations of certain laws, like the Service Contract Act. This is why we'll go into detail, but this is why your teaming agreements and subcontracts need to be fantastic. The rules aren't going to tell you what needs to go in those, really, other than a couple FAR flow downs we'll talk about. But you still need to make sure you have everything you are subject to that could apply to the prime or to the sub in that contract, to make sure you can say, yeah, government, you can hold me accountable. I'm going to turn around and hold my sub accountable. Consent to subcontract. Contractors often can subcontract to whoever they want, but not always. Sometimes consent's required. I'm not going to talk about this too much. You can find it in FAR 52244-2, but essentially sometimes the government gets to say yes or no, especially on certain types of contracts. Responsible subcontractors. So subcontractors need to be responsible as defined in FAR Part 9. Prime generally can't issue a subcontract over $35,000 to any entity that's been debarred, suspended, or proposed for debarment. So you can't just pick a sub and go from there. Got to do your research, got to make sure they're okay. Even on top of that, you are going to be relying on the documents the sub gets to you and what the sub tells you about its size, about its status, about its, whether it's debarred, things like that, even though some of that is public. This is why a solid set of reps and certs is absolutely necessary in your TA and your subcontracts, making sure it's clear. If you're relying on the subcontractor's assertions to do things, then you have a right to rely on those and come after the subcontractor if those are false. Very briefly, again, limitations on subcontracting. I have done giant webinars on this. I'm going to do my best to keep this short. So what is a limitation on subcontracting and when does it apply? This is a very important slide because there's a lot of miscommunication here with contractors, and you'll see that in the note. So it applies in two situations. One, a full or partial small business set-aside contract over the simplified acquisition threshold. So that simplified acquisition threshold applies when you're talking about small business set-asides only. Situation two, any, keyword any, 8A, SDVOSB, WOSB, hub zone, any of those socioeconomic set-asides, whether they're competitive or sole source, it's going to apply. Notice the giant lack of the simplified acquisition threshold language there because it doesn't matter. And just in the last couple of weeks, I've had clients say, hey, so this is an SDVOSB contract below the simplified acquisition threshold. We don't have to worry about the limitation on subcontracting. Wrong, and so risky. Many contractors do incorrectly believe that, but that is not the case. Any sole source set aside for any sole source or competitive set aside contract for a socioeconomic status. So this says new. I'm not going to go into detail on the old, but Jill did mention a little bit, the FAR doesn't always match with the SBA rule. We have had an SBA rule for the limitation on subcontracting for a long time now. Maybe like a decade, that reads exactly like I'm going to read this to you, but the FAR rule was just recently updated to match it. So it was a lot of fun for contractors for what I believe about a decade to try to figure out which one they needed to follow because they were different. For service contracts, no more than 50% of the amount paid by the government can be paid to a non-similarly situated entity. For now, keep in mind, if you are on a small business contract and you are a small business, a similarly situated entity would be a small business. I do have a slide on this. We'll talk about it a little more. Supplies, except for non-manufacturers, which we will talk briefly about. Again, 50% of the amount paid by the government. And that is the important term. That is the term that was changed recently in the FAR, but that is the one that matters, may be paid to entities that are not SSEs. SSE, similarly situated entity. I will shorten that. And then all set-aside contracts, prime may meet requirements through the use of an SSE. This is just a quick 5-step LOS limitation on subcontracting calculation. I do not want to go into a ton of detail here because we could talk about it all day. First step, determine your category. That's going to depend on the NAICS code of the contract. You're either going to be services, supplies, general construction, or specialty trade. Yes, there are mixed contracts. There are contracts that have both services and supplies, maybe IT, and also supplying some laptops. You need to see which one is listed as the primary NAICS code on the contract. If it is services, then services is what's going to govern, and you will actually exclude any supply money. And if it's supplies, then it's supplies LOS, and you will exclude the services funds. So step 2, you start with the amount paid by the government. The only exception to this is for non-manufacturers. That's a whole other rule all its own. We're not going to go into it. Non-manufacturer rule can be found at those regulations right there. If you are a non-manufacturer, you don't worry about this. That is considered an exception to this rule. Step 3, you're going to exclude certain costs. This is going to depend on the limitation on subcontracting category, and a lot of them don't actually have any exclusions. Many service contracts do not have any exclusions. You will have some for example, construction and for certain types of supplies contracts. Things like cost of materials will be excluded, and that is limited. So you just want to make sure you know what kind of contract you're performing. You want to match that NAICS code, and that's going to be the one that matters. That's going to tell you what costs you can exclude. In step 4, apply the minimum performance. Each limitation on subcontracting category has a minimum percentage for prime's performance plus any SSEs. So we just briefly, this is supplies and services are both 50%. We mentioned that one already. General construction, 15%. That's much smaller. And construction's kind of its own world because of all that construction entails. You kind of get a smaller limitation, and you can have a little more of the kind of big picture administrative type stuff where you are overseeing contracts and subcontractors. But again, for another day. Special trade construction is going to be 25%. And then step 5, final step, address any SSEs. So any similarly situated entities also going to depend on what the contract is set aside for. And if it's small business set aside, you're a small business and you have a small business sub, that actually is going to count toward your bucket. I like to think of it as two buckets: the buckets that are being performed by a small business, by the prime, or another small business for a small business set aside, and then the bucket for anything that doesn't fit that bill. So any large business subcontractors. And then again, depending on step 4, depending on which type of contract you're in, you know what percentage that bucket has to meet. Under the new limitation on subcontracting, the small prime can meet its self-performance goals by subcontracting to an SSE. We just talked about that. That will count towards the prime bucket, the first bucket. And an SSE, just to give you the definition, is the same socioeconomic designation required by the prime contract. So if it's a hub zone, then your SSE is going to be a hub zone. And the other party, the SSE, needs to be small for the NAICS code that the prime contractor has assigned to the subcontract. The subcontractor will perform. I don't want to go too much into that one, but that is essentially, there's really two things for an SSE. Generally, if you have a hub zone, it's going to be small for your procurement as well, but that's just the way to look at it. The other big thing to consider when you're subcontracting is going to be ostensible subcontractor affiliation. So the big picture, SBA considers a small prime contractor to be affiliated with its subcontractor for purposes of a set-aside contract where the prime is unusually reliant on its subcontractor. So what does unusually reliant mean? There's a ton of case law out there, but essentially, if the prime's not really the one that's able to perform this work. Now, it's okay to say the prime needs the sub and the sub needs the prime to do this work. It's a big contract. They need each other. But what you can't have is the prime being so reliant on the sub that the sub is really the one pulling the strings. The sub is totally necessary for this work, and the prime could not do it on its own. The other factor there is the primary and vital. So those are the two in all of the case law for what is an ostensible subcontractor: is unusually reliant and primary and vital. The prime can't be unusually reliant, and the sub can't perform the primary and vital parts of the contract. So what is primary and vital is going to depend 100% on the type of work you're doing. It's another question I can't always help my clients with. I've done lots of memos and analysis, and I'm happy to do those for clients. We can work through it together. But really, it's going to come down to you do the work. You know what the important parts are. There is a lot of case law out there about what makes up the primary and vital for certain types of work. As I said, for construction, it looks way different than for certain services contracts, but it's going to come down to very fact-specific analysis. And then with this ostensible subcontractor affiliation, so what's it mean? What happens if they say you have an ostensible subcontractor? This can be very bad. The prime and sub sizes will then be added together. So if you have a small business set aside, small prime, large sub, you could be in trouble because now you exceed the size standard. The prime isn't eligible. And depending on, the kind of mens rea there, whether you knew this or whether you were aware of these regulations and still bid and said you were small eligible, you could face other penalties, False Claims Act violations, and other big deal like that. And there's some really big financial penalties as well. SBA evaluates these on a case-to-case basis. Like I said, they're going to look at the totality of the relationship. They're going to, unusually reliance is going to depend, primary and vital is going to depend, and they're going to look at all of the facts here and make a decision if in the instance that it goes to OHA and OHA does an analysis of your case. Best practice, just reduce and eliminate the number and severity of the risk factors as identified. And we're just going to run very quickly through these risk factors and some of them. Subs incumbency. Was the sub an 8A firm that graduated and is no longer eligible to perform 8A work? Did they go find themselves an 8A prime and say, great, now we're doing the work again? That can be a risk factor just because the agency is looking to see, are they just trying to stay on this contract even though they're not eligible anymore? The other thing is, what is the prime planning to hire from the sub? The majority of the workforce coming from the sub is a no-no. Contract managers, the big picture managers, the project manager coming from the sub, typically a big risk factor. Highest ranking contract managers on the sub's payroll, the lower ranking contract managers on the sub's payroll. So just importantly, none of these are just prohibited. but you really want to reduce these. Sometimes you will have to have one or two of these, just that's the way it works. We don't have this personnel, the sub does, but you want to really minimize these. The prime lacks the experience and has to rely on the subs to win. Things like all the past performance was submitted in the sub's name. Prime relies on the sub for critical financing, bonding, equipment, or facilities. If the prime couldn't perform any of this, didn't have the bonding capabilities or equipment, and the sub has it all, that's a problem. Sub will perform the more complex or important tasks, and prime is largely administrative. This goes to kind of that primary and vital. And then sub performing more work is likely to be ostensible subcontractor. So this one to me doesn't make a lot of sense, but there is case law on it. Basically saying if your sub is doing 20% of the work, and you're less likely to have ostensible subcontractor. If your sub is doing 50% of the work, although that is completely allowed under the regulation, you're more likely to have ostensible subcontractor than if they were doing 20. Another thing, already talked about this, splitting profits. That's not a good thing. That can be seen as a de facto joint venture because those are the teams that split profits, not primes and subs. If the sub does the entire proposal, if the prime doesn't have full oversight of the proposal or final say in the proposal, those are big ones we put in the TAs. If the TA terms are unfavorable to the prime and actually favor the sub, that I mentioned that case where that was decided in an example, and the TA proposal don't break down the task. We talked about this a little with Jill as well. When you're not breaking down those tasks between the prime and sub, it's very hard for the agency or the SBA to look and say, we think you're going to meet the limitations. And it looks like the prime is really performing the work. All right, we will jump right into TAs.
We do have a question from Bruce, again, for the USPS unsolicited proposal. Are socioeconomic entities proposing an unsolicited proposal viewed more favorably by federal agencies than non-socioeconomic?
So the agencies always have certain quotas. They're goals. They're not quotas. They have small business contracting goals. They need to try to give 5% of work to WSBs. They need to try to give a certain amount of work to 8As. 8A in particular, there are additional rules for things like once 8A, always 8A, where if work has been in the 8A program, it has to stay there. So generally, if you have socioeconomic statuses to offer, then yes, that is good because the agency gets to count those towards its goals. However, there's certain work the agency just knows that it's going to be a large business or it's probably going to be a small business. There's not a lot of SDBOSBs that perform it or something like that, in which case it won't matter whether you have that status. It's all going to depend on what it's set aside for.
My question really was, if there are set asides, they have specific budgets. So how would that one know which type of entity is more advantageous in terms of government and agencies have more budget for new technology, for new ventures versus, like set asides? Maybe they have a limitation on budgets. And I guess what I'm asking is, for me, what's that more advantageous type of entity that I need to partner in order to present this proposal, because this is quite large, in our view, would be a large type of budget that would require.
Sure. I mean, I can't give you advice on who to partner with. Now, I can tell you what Jill said about just talking with the agency ahead of time. I think is going to give you that answer as well. Let the agency know what you're proposing unsolicited and what you'd like to perform, and then ask them, is there a certain socioeconomic set aside you all would have in mind for this? That you're trying to make some teaming plans and you want to make sure that if it is going to be set aside, if they want to release it under certain type of socioeconomic status, that they let you know what that's going to be.
I concur. Yeah, I concur with what Nicole's saying.
That's great. That's exactly what I wanted to find out. Yes, to ask them about that.
Yep. And just, you can talk very openly with a contracting officer. Typically, if they know you're doing your best to meet their needs and meet the requirements, they're going to be very open with talking with you, especially where there's not competition out there and they need to be worried about, unequal discussions or anything like that, where they can just talk to you openly. A lot of times they will.
Very good. Thank you.
Yep, of course. Teaming agreements. Again, we love them. We say do them. We say you should never subcontract without them. The FAR doesn't necessarily require them. However, procuring agencies more and more often these days are requiring them. They're asking for TAs to be submitted with the proposals. And this is so they can look at things like subcontractors' past performance. They don't want to see a proposal with, 1 prime experience and 3 sub experience, and they don't even know what the sub's going to be doing on the work, because you don't have a subcontract typically until that work is awarded. So the agency doesn't want to sit and guess, well, great, the subcontractor has amazing IT experience. They want to see how that's going to come into play, and you can do that through a TA. A lot of times they will not even consider your subs unless you have a TA showing the division of work. They will also use those to analyze limitations on subcontracting compliance and ensure there's no ostensible subcontractor affiliation concerns. Why use a TA? Because we love them and we say so. Because you need to lock in commitments from your prospective teammates as well. This is really important. It happens more than you think. The prime doesn't want to rely on a prospective subcontractor's qualifications and resources, submit that past performance, say the sub's going to do all this with us, gets this award, that's awesome. And then the sub says, nah, I want to work with somebody else. That you can lose an award that way. You can also leave the prime scattering to try to figure out how to meet all these things it said it could meet. And then vice versa. The sub doesn't want to spend time and energy on a proposal for the prime to say, oh, we actually decided we don't need you. Thanks for wasting your time and giving us your costs and working with us on this proposal, but we are not going to work with you. So why use a TA? To establish rules for exclusivity, just like that last example I gave. You want to say, hey, and it's going to depend on the FAR a little bit. We'll talk about it. It's going to depend also on the solicitation. For example, CIO SP4, I talk about that a lot because it was so unique. It allowed for you to bid as a prime sub team, as a JV team on the same work. It was really unique in its exclusivity. So you still have to look out always for the FAR's improper business practices. Make sure there's no price fixing going on where you're bidding a certain amount, you're the one bidding for multiple offers, so you're fixing your prices, but at the same time, it's going to depend, and there is a little flexibility. So you need to figure out what you want. If you are the prime, do you want that sub to offer subcontractor work to any other primes? If it is allowed, are you going to allow that? And vice versa. Do you want the prime to have relationships with other subs? Is that okay? Is it the type of work where they're going to have 5 subs? Or is it the type where the 2 of you can perform it alone and you don't want them having other subs, which could take your place? Just got to figure it out ahead of time. This can help you avoid disputes later on. It can also, as I said, demonstrate compliance with the limitation on subcontracting and ostensible subcontractor rule. Couple best practices. Identify a specific project to be pursued by the prime and sub team. An agreement to pursue multiple projects is not a standard teaming agreement. This is another form. We call them master teaming agreements. We do them as well. I won't say don't do them. However, anytime you can do a specific TA for a specific project, I recommend doing that. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. Get yourself a really good TA that you like, that you make sure it's got all these best practices. It really protects your rights. It's got the things you want in it. Tailor it to a specific project. And then when you find another one, do it again. There's no reason not to do it that way. And I don't necessarily think it takes far more time or anything. Master TA is going to be more like, here's the big picture standard principles these parties are going to use to bid work together. And then you would do some kind of addendum, some kind of addition exhibit where you say, hey, this is a specific project. Here's the details of this project. Those are okay, but you need to be careful with those just to make sure you're tailoring everything to each specific project. Again, use the name of the agency of the solicitation when available. Going to be different rules, going to be different types of limitations, things like that. You want to make sure you are referring directly to the solicitation. And like I said, CIO SP4, all these crazy additional requirements, even for TAs, which don't normally have requirements. So you want to make sure you are carefully reading those and referring directly to them. And then this is a big one, identify which will be prime and which will be sub. Agreements to flip roles are usually problematic, just like they were for joint ventures. They can indicate that you are actually affiliates and you're just agreeing to perform in whichever way benefits you both all the time. They want to see more structure. They want to see that this is an established relationship where the prime is clearly going to be the prime and the sub is clearly going to be the sub. They don't want to see flexibility there. And then talking about what each brings to the table, just like the JVs, who's going to provide which personnel, which resources, where are they going to work, what are their costs, things like that are all going to be really important to set out as soon as you know them. And then again, if the prime is, for example, an SDVOSB, and this is SDVOSB work, it's important to put in the TA why you qualify for that work, so the agency is not searching for that when it wants to make sure you have a compliant arrangement. Exclusivity provisions. We already talked a little bit about these, but essentially you want to make sure the subcontractor is going to do what you want them to do. If you don't want them to work with other primes, put it in there. And that if it's a certain scope, you want to make sure, for example, if you are the sub and you want to make sure the prime is only going to get those IT services from you as a sub, even though they're fine getting other subcontracted work, then put that in there. If the sub is not exclusive, consider the FAR certificate of the independent price determination. I already mentioned that, not going to go back into it. Want to make sure you're not risking any FAR violations with price fixing or anything like that. And then be careful that you don't draft overly restrictive provisions that can run afoul of the prohibition on restrictions on subcontractor sales to the government. Things like the sub will not work with the government at all. It's okay to make things very specific to that prime contract. For purposes of that prime contract, the sub is not going to be in direct privity with the government. We talked about that, but you do need to be careful you're not pretty much preventing the subcontractor from ever working with an agency or something like that. That's where you could run afoul of those. And then resolving potential post-award disputes. These disputes could be, are they guaranteed a subcontract? We often make sure that's in there, and they don't have to be. You can say the team plans to pursue this if they can negotiate a subcontract and they think that it's going to be in everybody's best interest. A certain scope of work will go to the sub. If within 30 days they can't negotiate it, they won't. You have flexibility, but you do need to say what you're going to do there. You need to make it clear so you're not arguing about it later on or pulling the rug out from anyone who worked on the proposal. Is the sub term going to be coextensive with the prime contract term? That's something like, the subcontract will run for the base year. And then if any options are awarded, you could say the prime gets to pick. You could say that it will automatically be extended. Again, up to you, but you need to say what it's going to be. Scope of work, and then how the sub's going to be paid. Standard stuff you want to establish if you can. Division of proposal responsibilities. The prime needs to play the lead role. Sub, again, could be that affiliation. Sub's role is going to be limited to its own scope and pricing, typically when it comes to the proposal. You don't want to give the sub full reign over the proposal. You say maybe they have authority over their own part, but generally the prime has full authority. Parties typically agree to go Dutch. So each party covers their own proposal writing expenses. This is, again, something just looks fair, reads equitable. I don't recommend veering too far from this. If you have another plan, as long as it's fair and isn't going to indicate affiliation, go for it, just establish it. Couple other termination. If the government terminates a subcontract for convenience, is the prime able to then do so? You want to put that in there. If the prime decides not to submit a proposal, is it going to terminate the TA? For those master TAs, maybe not. For a specific one, it usually will. If another prime contractor wins the award, and typically you'll say something in there like, except unless there's a protest and you are waiting to see if that protest is successful. Parties can't agree on a subcontract, will typically terminate it. One party defaults, will typically terminate it. And then disapproval of a subcontractor, if it's required, could also terminate it. And then non-disclosure provisions, really important to make sure that you have either a separate NDA that the TA refers to that's going to govern your work on those projects, or you have those provisions included in there, just, typical NDA provisions, but you have to make sure you include the FAR's whistleblower rights. You can read those sections of the FAR, but those are required for government contracting work. And then our final section here, talk a little bit about subcontracts, and then I will wrap it up. Subcontracts, big picture, this is going to supersede or replace the TA. So typically we refer to the TA as a chasing the contract document. The subcontract is the performing the contract document. So one, there's a timeline. It starts with the TA. As soon as you get that award, you switch to a subcontract and it supersedes the TA. Usually there is much more detail in the subcontract than the TA, but a well-written TA might give you a run for your money on that one. You need to include the mandatory FAR provisions in the subcontract. I do have clients ask me a lot, what's all mandatory in the TA? Not nearly as much. In fact, really whistleblower protections are the only ones I think is a guaranteed need to put it in there, although it's good to include things like limitation on subcontracting compliance. The actual flow downs requirements, ones that you could lose a contract if you don't have, are typically for the subcontract itself. And then SBA's regulations provide additional, sometimes very little known, subcontract requirements. We'll touch on those briefly. Flow downs. A flow down is a provision of the prime that the prime has to include in the subcontract. Has to sometimes, but also just should. So there's some that are absolutely required, and then there's some that we recommend simply for the reasons we talked about earlier. If you were on the hook for something the sub did, you want to make sure they have to abide by those same rules that you do, as long as it doesn't become something that's just nonsensical because it clearly only applies to the prime. So the FAR requires you to flow down a few of these anti-kickback procedures. You can find them at that FAR provision. But failing to flow down when required is actually a breach of your contract with the government. So if you are required to put that in a subcontract and you don't, that could be very problematic. You could get terminated and lots of things. Common mistakes with flow downs: don't use an oral subcontract. We talked about this already, but you can't effectively flow down FAR clauses. And also don't do an unedited commercial subcontract. They don't care about the FAR. They may be the best commercial subcontract ever. It might be Microsoft's contract. It's not going to care about the FAR if it's not doing federal work, so it's not going to work for you. Don't including your in flow downs in a consulting agreement or a vendor agreement because you don't think it's a subcontract. We already talked about that one. Good chance it's going to be. Any agreement that could even qualify as a subcontract, you need to put them in there regardless of what you call the agreement, even a 1099. And then flowing down the entire thing. Talked about this a little too. Some of these provisions are going to be totally nonsensical. Some of them are clearly only applicable to the prime. So you don't want to just say, hey, and the sub is absolutely subject to every single flow down. Every single FAR provision that's included in the prime is going to be flowed down. And in fact, that can give the sub some rights that you don't necessarily want to give them, because they should be rights the prime has against the government. They may not be ones you want the sub to have against the prime. Subcontractor scope of work, you need to be very specific here to help avoid disputes. We talked about that a little. If you are going to guarantee that sub a certain type of work, a certain scope of work, put it in there. And then the sub, especially if you're the sub, has the ability to say, hey, I'm guaranteed this. You can't sub this to someone else. Payment and invoicing, is it going to be a paid when paid, or how will the sub be paid? Fixed price, time and materials. Make it, usually it resembles the prime, but sometimes if there's a unique scope of work being subcontracted, it may be different. So just make sure you know what it's going to be. And then pass through dispute resolution. Already talked about this too, but essentially, whether you're the prime or the sub, it's very important to have these pass through dispute resolution clauses. If you are the prime and your sub gets mad at the government, you do not want to be the one the sub comes after, and then you separately have this whole issue where you have to then try to pursue something against the government, and you have to try to show how you were harmed, even though it was the sub that was harmed. It's a mess. As the sub, you don't want to be left there with the rug pulled from under you. If the government does something wrong, you have no one to blame. The prime didn't actually do it. That's who you'll have to come after, but you don't have a direct recourse with the government unless there's a pass-through claim. Essentially what this says is, if the sub comes to the prime and says the government messed up, here is my claim, the prime has to then take that to the government. Now, typically it'll be something like, if it is the sub's claim, the sub's going to have to pay for all of it. But again, if you want to do that differently, just make it very clear. Termination. This is commonly misunderstood, is a termination for convenience and mandatory flow down clause. It actually is not. So you should not just assume that if the government terminates your prime contract for convenience, that you're off the hook with your sub. You need to make it really clear in the subcontract so that you don't have a situation where you're still paying the sub for something that you're no longer getting paid for. What are the prime and sub default rights? Are you entitled to a cure notice? If the prime doesn't pay the sub on time, is there a cure period? If the sub doesn't provide a service it's supposed to, or does a faulty service, do they get to fix it? Again, up to you based on the nature of the work and all that, but you need to make it clear. Non-disclosure provisions, talked about that in the TA, same type of thing. Typically, it's almost a direct copy paste for us. We like to keep things very standard. If you were subject to certain non-disclosure in the TA, should be subject to the same thing in the subcontract, but again, have to have those whistleblower clauses allowing anybody, any employees of any company to report fraud, waste, and things like that. Ensuring compliance with the limitation on subcontracting. Again, if it's set aside, you want to make that really clear in your subcontract in the event you're protested. Even having a provision to point to saying, yeah, we know what it is. Here's our breakdown and it is compliant is often enough to get you through that as long as you are honoring the terms of that. And then term of the subcontract, just like the TA, base and options. Are you planning to automatically exercise those or not? Finally, reps and certs. We talked about this. If you as the sub are making certain assertions to the prime and the prime is relying on those, for example, limitation on subcontracting. You tell the prime you're small. The prime says, great, I can put this in my small business bucket for our small business set aside, but you are lying. The prime needs to have some recourse there because they relied on you telling them you were small. So all of that is important to establish. Conflict of interest is a really big one. You want to make sure that the prime and sub have to follow that. If the sub had a COI, it could actually affect the prime unless the prime does some sort of provision in there saying that the prime would or the sub would be on the hook. Compliance with law, just asserting that both will comply with the law. That gives you certain recourse from in your own subcontract if the subcontractor fails that you would not otherwise have. And that is all I've got. Woo, that was a lot of slides. So take a look here. I will open it up to questions in a minute. 8A program handbook. I co-authored this with our founding partner, Stephen Koprinz, who is just one of the titans of this industry, who's now retired and teaching, but fantastic book for any 8A program participants. If you're thinking about the 8A program, heck, if you're teaming with an 8A company and want to make sure that they're following the rules, this book is fantastic. Plain English, gives you all the rules, talks a lot about teaming. And then my current equity partner with me is Shane McCall, who wrote this other fantastic book, Pitfalls and Procedures of Size Protests and Appeals. These are fantastic. I mentioned protests several times here. I didn't go into detail, but what do you do if you think somebody who just won an award that you wanted is actually not going to follow these ostensible subcontractor rules? You file a size or status protest or both. This book tells you all about that, how to do that, best practices, and what it means if one gets filed against you. And having these documents I've been talking about relentlessly will be great way to combat these assertions, to show that you know the rules and you're following them and you have considered all of them ahead of time. So in addition to the books, sign up for our free monthly e-newsletter. That's all the links are right there. Our LinkedIn updates. We post all about our blog on there. Our Small GovCon blog is an amazing free resource for, PTAX, I've had many SBA representatives tell me that they read our blog religiously. I've had agencies tell me they read our blog religiously. It is a fantastic resource and I highly recommend it. That's all I've got for slides. So I will turn it back over to Jill or anyone who has questions.
I just want to say thank you so much. And those of you that this may be new information to you, it's going to take some time to really understand the nuances of federal government, and just to give yourself that time and to work with PTAX and to work with your SBA offices, because the importance of understanding how federal procurement works will contribute to your success. And I will just reiterate and back what Nicole has said in when you're forming a teaming arrangement or joint venture agreement, you just want to make sure that you're protecting yourself in the arrangement. And I remembered early on, you said taking like 8A templates, like archive templates. Oh my gosh, we get those questions all the time.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And just any joint venture template that's been published by SBA protects the SBA. It protects SBA's rules and regulations, which is why we recommend, if you can, speak to an attorney to have a joint venture agreement or a teaming arrangement. I wanted to ask you more about like that pass through. You mentioned it during teaming agreements, so that in the teaming agreement that protects the sub in that case, or just to make sure that the those are provisions that SBA doesn't have. So having those provisions built in to protect yourself, and not only you, but all of the partners, just to make sure that things are being done the way that you intended them to be done at the beginning. That was because I see the relationships when they go bad.
Oh, yeah. As do we, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and I often have clients tell me they want to save money by using a template or a commercial agreement, and I hate to tell them the truth, which is you're not going to save money if you're protested on this, and I have to defend you on something that I don't have much support for.
It's going to cost a lot more money in the long run.
Sure is.
And also just severed relationships, because no matter how wonderful the relationship is at the beginning, it can seriously change once a contract has been awarded, and you're really having to go through the work. So
Absolutely.
does anyone have any additional questions? I know that we're just going to end right here at noon, if not, but again, thank you so much. I don't see anything coming through right now. But again, thank you so much. And I feel like I learned something every time I hear you present.
Well, thank you so much, Jill. And thank you for your input today too. I love getting SBA input on things as well, because it's so nice to be able to say, hey, I actually talked to an SBA rep who agreed with me on this one. So appreciate you tremendously. And thank you guys so much for having me.
All right. And those of you that had asked, we will have the Zoom link available on the Ohio Business Matchmaker website and the Ohio University PTAC website. I saw that Sharon put that in the chat earlier. The slides will also be available, so in about a week. Okay, everybody. Well, thank you. Sharon, I think you can stop recording at this point.